He did bad things in the name of stability. Probably they had to be done, but he was not. He was a complex figure, and he did many things that can be criticized. And I suspect as time goes by, there will be perhaps a more balanced evaluation of what he did. But whatever people say, he was an enormous figure. I mean, he was incredibly talented at statesmancraft.
Margaret, it was put to us earlier on this program that meeting, Nixon in China, the coming together of China and the US was perhaps one of the most significant meetings in the 20th century because it has shaped to a large extent the way our world looks today. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think it was a revolution in the Cold War because what it did was break up the Soviet side. China and the Soviet Union were now apart. And I think it gave the United States an entry into China. It gave China an entry into the world. And we're seeing the results today. It looks in retrospect like a meeting that should have happened, but it took very difficult diplomacy to get it to actually take place.
And how much is that down to the personal ability of the diplomat? He's the most famous diplomat of our age. I think if you asked anyone to name many others who they'd recognise as readily as Kissinger, they wouldn't be able to. He feels that he's sort of a relatively sui generis figure. How good a diplomat was he? How do you judge him?
Well, diplomats matter. It's like brokering a marriage. I mean, you have to get the two sides to agree on what the dowry is going to be and what the rules of the game are going to be. And I think it was something that on both sides, Mao and Nixon and people advising them thought should happen. But that didn't mean it was going to happen. And I think Kissinger was absolutely key in helping it to happen and in maintaining the relationship.
Stephen, Kissinger, a figure in your career, how's he been seen? How was he seen in the 70s and how is he seen now?
Well, he was much disliked in the 70s by my generation, I have to say. I mean, we thought of Pinochet and his death. We thought of the illegal bombing of Cambodia and the wiretapping of colleagues, like my former colleague Bill Beecher, who broke the illegal bombing story. But much like Brzezinski, the world is an ugly place, and Kissinger understood that. And he understood that big powers need to exercise their power in a balancing way, often in a not very moral way. So one can condemn him, but one also, in a way, needs to appreciate his insights. At the same time, he was incredibly duplicitous. He lied all the time. He was terrible to his subordinates. He got enormous work out of them. There are very funny stories about him. He had tantrums. He was very insecure. And at the same time, he continued to advise presidents all the way up to Joe Biden, which is quite an impressive feat, particularly on China.
That's interesting. And Russia as well, also, Steve. I mean, do you think it's kind of characteristic of the man that when you look at the situation with Russia and Ukraine, the attitude of a man like Kissinger would be, how do we do a deal with Putin? Because deals need to be done.
Well, it's not so much how to do a deal, but how do we restrain? How do we deter? How do we have a relationship that's stable? That's what really interested him, that didn't lead to escalation, that didn't lead to war. I think that's really what he was about. He was, in some ways, eager to keep American power, but also to keep the world as much balanced and status quo as possible. And this new world, which the cliche is poly-crisis, I think puzzled him somewhat.
That's interesting. But there's another cliche that's often used, being on the right side of history, which is, of course, in many ways an impossibility. As a historian, what is his legacy? What do you think? How do you think history will treat Kissinger now that he's dead?
Well, what will happen, of course, is initially people will say very nice things about him, and then there will be, I hope, a more balanced assessment, which Stephen has pointed out. You know, the way he did bad things in the name of stability. Probably they had to be done, but he was not. He was a complex figure, and he did many things that can be criticized. And I suspect as time goes by, there will be perhaps a more balanced evaluation of what he did. But whatever people say, he was an enormous figure. I mean, he was incredibly talented at statesmancraft. I mean, I don't know if that's a word, but he was like his idol Metternich, who brought stability in his own way to Europe at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. And I think Stephen's absolutely right that what he cared most about was stability and the great powers getting on, because he knew, he'd seen it himself. He'd been a young officer in the Second World War, but he knew it through reading history. He knew what the alternatives were, and he was prepared to go a very long way to create that stability.
Do you think do you think we've lost that? Is it possible for you to say this? I don't know, Margaret. That that great man theory of history's always been there, and it's now great men and women, of course. Are people as influential now? It feels that when you look back into the past, even the 70s and the 60s, one person could be more influential than they can be now. Maybe that's just how we always look at the past. But do you think that's true?
Yeah, well, I would rather not live in a world where great men matter, or great women matter for that matter. But it does matter who is in power at a particular time. And Henry Kissinger was enormously influential because he was enormously effective. And I know we look around the world today. I mean, the world would be a different place if we didn't have Donald Trump and we didn't have Vladimir Putin, and we didn't have Xi Jinping. So, occasionally individuals can really affect the course of history. And I think Kissinger was a great statesman, and he did make it possible for both the Soviet Union and the United States to get on, and for the United States and China to get on. And I think we could all be grateful for that.
Stephen, just finally, do you think we will? Do you think we should have a culture war over Kissinger? The right will see him as a pragmatist, a strong figure. The left, who get very angry about people they feel let them down morally by not adopting precisely the right cause, however unrealistic it might be. Are we going to see a bit of that, do you think?
Oh, I think it's inevitable. I don't know how one actually stops it. The one thing I do want to sort of say is Kissinger could be quite funny. I remember talking to him late in his life, and he was actually talking to Donald Trump quietly about China. So I asked him, this was in Berlin, what his conversations with Trump were about, and he said in his growly German voice, "This is all off the record." But now he's dead. So basically what he said was, the president does not have an orderly mind. That was his comment.